All right, so the last thing we're going to do and then is to create a while loop that's going to be based on a counter instead. In other words, it's going to keep track of, we're going to know ahead of time how many times we want to run this loop. And so we're going to do a scenario where we're going to simulate a calculator. And the idea is that we're going to ask our user, let me kind of walk through what I've set up here. We're going to ask our user if we're going to multiply or add the numbers that they're going to provide us, just kind of like a calculator. And then we're going to ask them to either enter M or N. So do they want us to multiply the numbers or do they want us to add the numbers? And then just to satisfy this example, we're going to ask them how many numbers they will be entering. Now in a calculator, you just keep entering until you hit equals, but we're going to ask them ahead of time, how many numbers do you anticipate entering? So that way we know how many times to go through a loop. And so I have some documentation here to kind of help you figure out what I was trying to do with my variables. So if you need to refer to that, that's what's here. So string operation is what we're going to use to keep track of whether they entered an M or an A. Quantity of numbers, we're going to ask them ahead of time. How many numbers do you want to enter? So we know how many times we're going to go through our loop. We also set up the number. So that's the number that they're going to enter each time, 5, 6, 8, or whatever it is. And then total is going to keep track of the total calculation. If we're multiplying or adding, we need some way to keep a running total every time we go through that loop. And then counter is what I set up to enable us to, if they told us they're going to enter in 5 numbers, well, we have to keep track. We've entered in 1 number, we've entered in the second number, we've entered in the third number, which is also synonymous with how many times we're going to go through this loop. And so I think that's what I set up ahead of time. I also set up some little ideas here so I remember what we need to do, kind of pseudo coding is what it's called. Set up ahead of time a roadmap so I know what to put where, and maybe that'll help make my code a little bit easier to write. So kind of planning it out ahead of time. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the loop based on how many times they told me that they were going to put in. So they're going to put in quantity of numbers. And so I'm going to create a loop that says as long as counter, so that's my keeping track of, I went in 0 times 1 times 2, that's my placeholder of how many times I went in, while counter is less than quantity numbers. So that's our way of setting up a loop that will loop through however many times that the person said they wanted to loop through. So the important part of this particular piece is that I make sure every time I go through the loop that I increment counter. So counter started off as 0. So when I first come in here, counter is 0, but they want to go in 5 times, for example. So when I finish this loop, I'm going to make sure I increase counter by 1. So the next time counter will be 1 less than quantity numbers, and then 2, 6, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to do what's called a incrementer, counter plus plus, which is another way of writing counter equals counter plus 1. So it's just a little shortcut version of that. So in other words, I'm just incrementing counter by 1 every time. And so this provides me with a way to get out of the loop. So for sure, every time counter is going to start off at 0 because that's what we started it at. And every time we go through the loop, counter is going to get incremented until it gets to a point where it's less than quantity numbers. And then we'll be able to exit the loop. And so if I wanted to test that, I could say cout counter, just so I could see that it was in fact working. So I'm going to run this real quick because I always like to run pieces at a time. So I'm going to run this code and it's off screen. So let me pull it forward so we can see it. Shall we multiply or add? Oops, I didn't actually get that information. So I'm going to need to do that. You can see I asked a question, but I didn't put a variable in to receive that information, but we'll add that. How many numbers will you be entering? Let's enter 3. And so we should see that our loop did in fact run 3 times, 0, 1, and 2. And as long as the counter was less than the quantity they entered, we continued until we found an exit point. So that's good. I got to make sure I get a input now. And so now we ask them what types should they enter. So we're going to do cin, and I think I put that in this variable called operation. And that's going to come in handy when we get into our loop. I need to know whether they typed in an M or an A, so I know whether to multiply or add the numbers that they entered. So let's see. So we got the number from the user. So we did that. Got the number from the, oh, we need to do that. Okay, so we need to get a number from them so we know what to add or multiply, right? So C in, C out, what number, let's see, enter a number, that makes more sense. Enter in a number. And then I'm going to end that with an end line, so I have some space, and then semicolon. And then we need to get that, we need to provide the variable for that number, and that number is, the user will enter in a new number each iteration, so that is the number. C in the number. Okay, so now we've done that. Get the number from the user. All right, so now the next step is to create an if block so we know whether or not to add those numbers together or multiply them. And so we have to check it each time. So we're going to do an if block. If, let's see, what was our variable here? If operation is the same as m, then we know that they're going to multiply. So we need to know we will multiply. Otherwise, we'll just assume for now that they put in the correct. They were good users, which is unusual, and they either put in an M or an A, that there were no other options. And we'll look at ways to, if they put anything else, we'll look at ways to do that later. But for now, we'll assume that they either put in an M or an A. So I'm just going to put else. We're just going to assume that the other number, assume then that they correctly put in, they entered an A, and actually this is going to catch everything, right? So we know that we will add the numbers. And so actually what's happening is we are doing some troubleshooting. So if they don't put an M, whatever else they put in, we're going to be multiplying or adding. So, okay, so if they put in a Q, we're going to be adding. If they put in an M, we'll be multiplying. If they put in a S, we'll be adding, because that's the way this if condition is set up. All right. All right, so now let's do our calculation. If it was multiply, then we need to multiply whatever we got a number. Enter in a number. Okay, so we're keeping track of the total in total, right? So total, and I'm going to say equals total, and we're multiplying here, times the number. So what we're suggesting here is whatever was in total, take that value, multiply it by the number they input, and put it back into total. Now you can also do, here's a shortcut for the same thing, you could also do multiply and equal. Oh, that's not a multiply. How about asterisk and equals? So that's multiply and equals, which is doing the same thing. Again, it's a shortcut. So take what was ever in total and then add, multiply the number to the new total. All right, so we'll do the same thing with addition. If it was addition, we're going to do total plus equals the number. And so now we have a scenario where, why are you not showing up? It runs a keep, that should be working. I don't know why it didn't do a thing, but that's okay. So we're adding. I'm not sure why the color didn't show up, but we'll certainly find out if we run something and it doesn't work. All right, and so now we should be adding or subtracting, or adding or multiplying, depending on how many times we're going to be in here, and then keep a running total. So that's what we're doing up here. And then update the counter so we can satisfy the while loop. Well, we've done that right here. And so the final thing is output the final result. And so after we're done with our while loop, we're going to, once we exit with the while loop, we're going to see out your total is, and then we'll put out the total. All right, so let's see how that works. We're going to run it and see if it works. All right, so there's my output. It wants to know if I want to multiply or add, so I'm going to multiply. How many numbers will you be entering? Let's just enter 2 just for now. Enter in a number. I'm going to enter in 5. And enter in a number. I'm going to enter in 8. And since my total is coming up with 0, I know something isn't working out right. So again, it's important to always check your work and find out what's going on. And so what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to try and ascertain from the output where I'm getting some trouble. And right here looks, oh, that's my counter. So there's my counter 0 and there's my counter 1. But for some reason, my total didn't work out right. So I need to go back and try and figure out in my code why that total didn't work out. Obviously, I don't know right off the top, but I am going to try and figure that out. All right, so I honestly don't know what I did wrong at this point. I feel like looking over everything, I did it right. So what I would do in that case is try and do some troubleshooting. And what I mean by that is if I feel like this is doing what it's supposed to do, and I know the loop is working correctly because it looks like it went in twice, which is how many times I said I would be entering in numbers. So I know the loop is working correctly, and I know I'm going into the loop. So then I want to ascertain a little bit more. Why is my total coming out 0? And so that's what I would do next. So I would do a little bit of just what we call debugging, where I might put something in. First, I might put something here that says cout. I am in here. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to make sure that I am in fact getting into this particular if condition. So if I typed in am I in fact getting in here? And the other thing I might do is I might cout the number, and I also might cout the total, just again to give me some information as to where it is that things aren't doing what I expected them to do. So now I'm going to run this code and I'm going to see what this troubleshooting debugging, if it gives me any clues as to what might or might not be working. So I'm going to type in capital M because I want to get it, make sure I go into this block of the code. So I type in M, how many times? I'm going to say 2, and enter in a number. I'm going to enter in the 5, and it says I am in here. 5 is working, but total isn't. And so this gives me a clue as to where I have run into some trouble. So it would appear to me that where I gave you this shortcut, maybe that shortcut isn't working the way I expected because total isn't actually getting a total. And so what I'm going to do is enter in a number and get out of here. And so let me go back to the basics and say, all right, well, total equals total times the number. And let's see if that doesn't now output something that I would expect to be a little bit more logically correct. So I'm looking for logic errors. So I'm going to try an M again. How many numbers? I'll enter 2. I'll enter number 5. And the total still isn't coming out right. So I have a problem there, and I don't know what my problem is. So what I'm going to do is just close out of this. And I'm going to look to see if I do have a total equals 0, and so that should be working. Total equals, so I know that this is all working, but there is definitely a problem here. All right, so I honestly put this video on hold because I couldn't figure out the answer. So if you figured out the answer before me, good for you, and bonus points. So I even went through and renamed the variable thing. What did I do wrong? Well, here's what I did wrong. All right, ready? Logic errors, and welcome to programming. So what I was doing was I initially set the number, I set total equal to 0. So when we came into the loop the first time, total was in fact 0. And so then I came down here and I said, all right, well, let's multiply whatever was in 0 to the number. So it multiplied 0 times the number and came out with 0. So that's why I was getting 0 in my totals. It's not that it wasn't accumulating. It did exactly what I asked it to do. So based on that, let's change the total to 1 the first time. And let's see if that doesn't make a difference in our program. So now I'm going to run this again. And I'm going to, let's see, I got my screen up here. Let me pull it over. So now let's try it. Now I'm going to do a multiply again. And I'm going to enter 2 numbers, and let's enter a 5. And remember, this is just the counter. So it is, in fact, doing 5 and 5, and then we're at iterator number 0. That was the placeholder. So I'll remove that just to be clear. And now we're getting 30, and then our incrementer is 1. So now this is making sense. So even the old timers and I don't mean old timers by me, but like other old timers, we do things that seem so simple, and then we get hung up by the fact that the computer does exactly what we ask it to do. So that was kind of frustrating on my part, but okay, it happens. In the meantime, I'm going to stop printing out that counter so that I can see that it's working. And now I should also know that I don't need this anymore. That was just for placeholder. But in the process, you saw what you can do to try and fix or debug when you don't know what's going on. So outputting information to yourself so that you can kind of get into the computer's head is a good lesson to learn. So now I'm going to run this again. Now that I know the multiplying is working correctly, I'm going to try it with the add. So I'm going to run my screen. I'll bring it back over here. And this time I'm going to add. And I think I'll add, I don't want to do that many. I'm just going to do 2. And then I'm going to enter a 6 and a 10, knowing that I should get 16. And I got 17 because I started off with 1 at the beginning. So something you have to pay attention to. I need to fix that so I don't have 17 ending up. And the reason I started off with a number in there is because I needed to, if I did plus equals, then I would have to, like if you're going to add something to total, then you have to have something in total to start. So maybe you could, if you wanted to do something really sloppy, I could do, and this is kind of sloppy, but it takes care of the moment. So I would do total equals minus equals 1. So that way it's always taking 1 off of that one that I initialized with. So again, running your code, running all of the possibilities to make sure you're getting the output that you expected. So now let's run that one more time and see what we get. So we're going to add, I'm going to add 8 and 2, and I should get, oh, I don't want to enter it 8 times. I wasn't paying attention. All right, so let's do this again. So we're going to add, I'm going to add 2 numbers. I'm going to add an 8 and a 2, and this time I should get 10. So now I'm really getting myself confused. So I entered in 2 and I subtracted 1. So let's take this out again and run that again. So now if I run 2, add, I have an 8 and a 2. Oh, I did it again. 7, not what I wanted to do. Control C. See, the lesson here is on an ice day, don't try to put together a video at the last minute, because I also have people trying to talk to me and I'm trying to do too many things at one time. So let's see if I can do this correctly finally. So we're going to add, I'm going to add an 8. I did it again. I don't want to enter 8 numbers in. All right, let's try this one more time. Sorry to waste all your video, but I guess maybe the lesson is it happens to all of us. So 2, enter in a number, I'm going to enter in an 8, and I'm going to enter in a 2, and I have 11. So, all right, so admittedly I put the video on pause and I had a lot of distractions going on. So now I'm focused on our problem at hand. And the problem at hand is that I have 2 issues. I need to have my total set to something before I get started, because otherwise, if I tried to do something like total equals total plus the number without something in total, let me just show you. So let me put this on. Let me just run this, and I'm not going to set total into anything. And so I'm going to run it, and so you'll see where my error is. And so somewhere there it is. So if I try to type in a number, I'm going to add, and it says how many I'm going to enter, and I'm going to say I'm going to enter in a 5. Well, it crashed. And the reason it crashed right here is because the code is saying, well, you're trying to put total into, you want me to add what was ever in total, but nothing has been put into total. So I'm really confused and I don't know how to fix that. So that's why we have to put something in total when we start. So that way, if we do plus equals or times equals, then it'll know what to do. But here's my problem. When I start with total equal to 0, if I multiply and I say total equals 0, then I'm going to have 0 times a number, which isn't going to be accurate. But if I start off with 1, then 1 isn't going to work because I've already got 1 in my accumulator for a plus before I even get started. So 8 plus 2 would equal 11. So how can I fix that? Well, you have to come up with some kind of algorithm to decide what you're going to do. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this at 0. And since counter is keeping track of how many times I went through here, what I decided I'm going to do is when I get inside M, so if they're going to multiply, and if this is the first time through, I'm going to reset total equal to 1. And so when we multiply 1 times whatever the number is the first time, I will get the correct number. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to do what's called a nested if. If counter is the same as 0. In other words, if this is the first time I went through this loop and operation was 0, then let's reset total equal to 0. And so by doing that, or equal to 1, sorry. And so by doing that, now my multiplication should work, my addition should work, and because counter is being iterated on the second round of the loop, counter will no longer be equal to 0, so it won't reset total to 1 every time. So let me run that and see if my numbers work now. So if I multiply, and I multiply 8, I want 2 numbers, and I multiply an 8 and a 2, then I'm getting 16. So that's correct. So I did that correct. And let's run it a second time adding to make sure that our little fixed our adding as well. And so now if I enter in an add, capital A, and I say how many will be entered, I'm entering 2, and I'm going to enter an 8 and a 2, then I should get 10, which I do. So unexpectedly, and yet in a good lesson, we've learned that we have to really pay attention to our logic errors. And if we have a logic error, we have to think through it. And what can we do to fix that little situation? And so I had to put in this little Band-Aid, if you will, so that both of my operators would work. So anyway, in this tutorial, unintentionally, you got a good view of what to do when things don't do what they're supposed to do, and how can you work through it. And the way that we worked through it was, first of all, I had to output some just kind of hokey code so that way I could figure out what was happening. And then in the end, figure out, oh, what was happening and how could I fix it. So anyway, this should be a good precursor to the assignment that I gave you guys, which was to work on the book purchase.